Welcome to the Pasadena Festival of Women Authors 2021 online. Hello, I'm Nora Morley, the chair of the festival. I'd like to thank our committee of volunteers who have worked so hard to bring you our fabulous 2021 authors in video presentations like this one. A unique aspect of our festival is that our authors share their journey as a writer and as a woman. In addition to providing a platform for women authors, we make grants to literary programs. Our recent program grants were made to Pasadena City College, Writer in Residence, Visiting Writer and Summer Writing Academy, Pasadena Public Library, One City, One Story, Pasadena Senior Center, Masters in Learning, PEN America Emerging Voices Fellowship, and the Right Girl Mentoring Program. To all of our donors, thank you for your generous support, and a special thank you to our community sponsors, starting with our lead sponsor, Clifford Swan Investment Counselors, where investment counseling is so much more than finances. It's providing wisdom for generations. And our publisher level sponsors, BNY Mellon Wealth Management and Payden Regal Investment Management. And our sponsors at the editor level and at the novel level. We are so happy that we've been able to bring our 2020 and 2021 authors to you with our online festivals. We look forward to seeing you in person on March 19th, 2022 at the Pasadena Convention Center with more fantastic women authors. And now, enjoy this author's story.
Hello, I am Mary Fauver Holmes, and as a member of the Author Selection Committee for the festival, I am very excited to introduce Dalia Sofer with us today to share her second novel, Man of My Time. Set in contemporary Iran and New York City, Man of My Time explores current and age-old questions of integrity and moral choices as it follows the life of the narrator, Hamid Mosafarian, from childhood to adulthood. The novel has received high acclaim. Dalia's first novel, The September of Shiraz, won a PEN Robert W. Bingham Prize and was a finalist for the Jewish Book Award. Dalia herself was born in Tehran and was raised in a Jewish family during a revolutionary period in Iran. At the age of 11, she moved with her family to New York City, where she attended the Lycée Français de New York. Dalia received her BA in French literature with a minor in creative writing at NYU and her MFA from Sarah Lawrence College. In Man of My Time, Dalia creates a complex portrait of a man struggling to come to terms with himself and his past. Her protagonist, Hamid, is a surprisingly engaging narrator, considering that his actions are fraught with evil, and how somehow it doesn't seem that he would be admirable, but he is. As Hamid recounts his life, he questions his long association with the Iranian regime and his own part in the violence that followed the revolution against the Shah. He seems haunted, and his introspection is gripping. Did he simply take wrong turns, as he states? Simply a victim trapped in this forced him to betray his friends? Or is he a selfish man, inherently devoid of empathy and compassion, a detached but willing participant? Can he be both? Is he, if not forgivable, redeemable? Reviewers of the book do not draw the conclusion any more so than Dalia does. The individual readers will have to make their own decisions. Dalia lives in New York, and while she finds New York welcoming and homey, she admits that in her heart, she wishes she could go back to Iran. We are, in fact, so lucky to have her with us here today, even virtually. Thank you, Dalia, and welcome.
Thank you so much, Mary, for that lovely introduction. I'm really very happy to be with you today and honored as well. I'm sorry it's virtual, but it's still really lovely to be together.
Well, we really are glad to have you and so appreciate your time and your support of our program too. And we're eager to hear your story about writing and your book and how you came to Man of My Time.
So I'll talk a little bit today about how I came to write my book, Man of My Time, and also a bit about the book itself and some of the themes within it as I see them at least. So in August 2016, on a muggy, oppressive New York afternoon, I heard within myself the voice of an indignant, disillusioned Iranian ex-revolutionary, the voice of the man who would become the protagonist of my novel, Hamid Mozaffarian. The book, I later realized, was in many ways born out of a desire to converse with and occasionally to confront my first novel, The Septembers of Shiraz, which was the story of a man wrongly imprisoned in the aftermath of the Iranian Revolution and was inspired by my own family's experiences. Like a whole generation of Iranians, I had lived through the revolution as a child and had witnessed the transformation of an entire society. My father had been imprisoned by the new government, and like countless others, we eventually fled, leaving behind our past, our friends, our home, even our language. In writing The Septembers of Shiraz, I tried to make sense of the fragments of the past, my own and others, by giving them shape and turning them into a coherent narrative. But while I felt a certain sense of calm after writing the novel, the post-publication period left me restless, making me realize that my attempt to connect fragments and create a narrative had done little more than further dissolve the whole. Man of My Time was born out of an opposing impulse to break down narratives of self, family, and country, and to explore how for every narrative there is a counter-narrative. Hamid Mozaffarian, the narrator, begins life as a solitary boy alienated from his family, grows up to be a revolutionary, and after an irreversible act of betrayal against his father, who works for the Shah's Ministry of Culture, gets involved with the new government, working for decades as an interrogator, and eventually, when he can no longer justify his own actions to himself, as an official in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. At the book's beginning, Hamid travels on a diplomatic mission to New York, where he encounters his estranged family after 38 years of separation and retrieves the ashes of his father, whose final wish was to be buried in Iran. While the entire book is written in the first person through Hamid's perspective, the narrative is actually made of multitudes, revealing discordant points of view and experiences. It is a narrative where conflict, not only among disparate groups and individuals, but also within one single man, is at the very center. The conflicts I explore in the book are many. They are between the revolution and the old regime, the upper classes and the lower ones, revolutionaries among themselves, young people of multiple generations and the old guard, artists and censors, governments and people, history and historiography, East and West. But more importantly, they are between a man and his family and a man with himself. But instead of viewing conflict as a clash between two sides, I saw it as a shifting space between interconnected entities, each simultaneously actor and subject. Among the central conflicts in the book is the one between Hamid and his father, Sadegh. Sadegh, who in his youth in the 50s was a pro-democracy activist and studied art history, gradually compromises his ideals, eventually taking a job in the Shah's Ministry of Culture and betraying a university friend named Hushang Habibi, also known as H, who became a subversive cartoonist. The magnum opus of Sadegh's life is a comprehensive encyclopedia of Persian art, which he compiles obsessively over several decades. Aware of chaos, yet perennially trying to contain it, he's a man eager to create order in a world that's constantly threatening to topple. Hamid, timid and hesitant as a boy, is too undisciplined a son for a man like Sadegh, and the two constantly clash. When young Hamid, already an insomniac, sits in the kitchen in the middle of the night and colors a drawing, He is accompanied by his father, who sits with him and reads, until sleep overtakes them both, and they each retreat to their bedroom, taking comfort in one another's unspoken vigilance. And throughout the years, the two continue reaching for each other, despite a persistent hostility that eventually draws an irreversible wedge between them. In adulthood, Hamid's path begins to mirror that of his father, as he too gets absorbed by ideals of social justice during the revolution, but eventually relinquishes his optimism of his youth as he says, slowly becomes the system. After his family's departure, Hamid begins to occupy his father's seat at the kitchen table, carries his father's monogrammed cigarette lighter, and for decades compulsively wears his father's old shearling coat. As he keeps repeating to himself, everything goes back to its origin. Another central conflict in the novel is between Hamid and the people he interrogates. But I chose not to include any actual passages of interrogation in the book, as I didn't want to feed the world's endless appetite for scenes of violence involving the Islamic Republic. At the same time, I didn't want to suggest that violence doesn't exist. My solution was to imply violence through allusion only, depicting two interrogation scenes that hint at boredom and absurdity rather than horror, and one sort of non-interrogation scene between Hamid and H, his father's old cartoonist friend. The scene is a kind of confession by Hamid, whereby he writes that he could speak of his actions but won't. And here I'll read a paragraph to give you an idea. This is Hamid talking. I would, if I thought it useful, offer the account of my interview with H. I would write, for example, that when he entered my confessional and sat blindfolded, facing the cement wall, listening to me as a Catholic hears the disembodied voice of the priest, he brought a finger to his forehead and placed it between his eyebrows, the spot known as the third eye, gateway to spiritual purity and the point of contact between the forehead and the prayer stone. That he whispered something under his breath, and when asked to repeat it, he said, "It's just a line from a poem. It means nothing here." That the tremor in his hand worsened as the day gave way to dusk, when at last he told me of his hypoglycemia, and I offered him 3 pieces of rock candy. That when I removed his blindfold, and against all rules, I revealed to him the name of my father and my own, his green eyes narrowed, and he said, "Pigeon flies with pigeon, hawk with hawk." I would write, too, of how I pressed him for names and monikers, dates and hours, opinions and dreams, beliefs and philosophies, crimes and sins, lovers and friends, and of how, by day's end, he looked at me across the table, between us my glass of tea, and said, "Do with me what you will, but you will see me every time you bring a glass of tea to your mouth, because I will be right there, sitting across from you, a face you will be unable to get rid of. For the rest of your days, Aghay Mozaffarian, you will be having a discourse with me." H's warning to Hamid does in fact haunt him throughout his life, as does the artist's face, his goatee and his impish smile. Nearly 3 decades later, while sitting in a cafe, Hamid suddenly thinks of a reply to H. You could say that we are like the Greek symbolon, a single coin broken in half, a witness to an exchange. He realizes at that moment that he and H will forever be linked, that captor and captive will remain key players in one another's biographies. One cannot undo the other. But most importantly, the central conflict in the novel is that between Hamid and himself. Though he is an interrogator, Hamid is more essentially a self-interrogator, and the novel is a kind of pilgrimage from ignorance to self-knowledge. Toward the end, as he finally engages in one rightful act, made in deference to his daughter and a future generation, he says, "If what prompted the change in my behavior fell short of repentance, it was nonetheless a final acknowledgement of who I was and a longing to shelter others from what I was capable of. My improvement, if you can call it that, lay not in an actual betterment of my character, but in the absolute acceptance of what the world had made of me and of what I had made of it." So in the book, each character's actions reverberate not only in his own life, but in the life of others and eventually across generations. Conversely, the collective actions of others create the world that envelops each character. The question of origins, too, is at the heart of this novel. Saadel, the father, is obsessed with the origin of objects, of stories, of history, even though he is aware that there is no absolute knowable origin to anything, and that new discoveries will always overwrite the old. His attachment to the Epic of Gilgamesh, the oldest known preserved written literature in the history of the world, is one manifestation of this obsession. He keeps track of each new tablet of the old epic as it gets discovered, going back in time as far as he can go. His encyclopedia of Iranian art is another manifestation. Endlessly compiling, he is a man trying to contain the world, to keep it from bursting at the seams, to solidify a narrative so he can make sense of himself and everything around him. But solidified narratives, as I said earlier, are an illusion. And for me, this extended to the very narrative of the Iranian Revolution. For a long time, I had subscribed to the predominant idea that the movement, initially fueled by Western ideals of democracy, had been hijacked at the last minute by the clerics. But over the years, I came to appreciate that this binary understanding was too simplistic. The forces behind the revolution were multiple. And for many people, religion was not antithetical to social justice, it was a vehicle toward it. I also wanted to re-enter the movement without the benefit of hindsight, because as people are living history, they are not often aware that they are living history, they're just living their lives. I wanted to enter that atmosphere of chaos, euphoria, and slow disillusionment that people were experiencing. I read a lot of articles in the New York Times archives and elsewhere having to do with those years to put myself in that moment as it was being lived, and also to understand how the movement was being explained and understood in the West, which, as I said earlier, has since created its own narrative of it. And by reading books and articles about modern day Iran, watching Iranian films, regularly listening to Iranian radio, and talking with friends who still travel and live there, I tried to capture a complex contemporary Tehran that's pulsating with life, art, and ideas, one very different from the state images often associated with the country. I want to talk about one other major inspiration behind the book, and that's Iran's vibrant artistic milieu, which often gets lost amid all the political talk. Several art exhibits sparked my imagination for this book. Among them was one held in 2013 at the Asia Society in New York. Called Iran Modern, it traced the evolution of modern art in Iran from the 40s until the 70s. While the show has been criticized for its lack of focus and for conflating modern with postmodern, among other shortcomings, it still provided a good entry point into Iranian artists' negotiation of modernity with tradition. In my novel, I explored this notion by examining how artists sought to create a new vernacular language that was in dialogue with Western art movements, but did not seek to emulate them. The same desire would later be reflected in the revolutionary movement's attempt to create a new form of government, one born from its own context, one that did not simply seek to mimic Western concepts of democracy. But in addition to offering an exploration of the interconnection between art and politics, writing about art also ended up just being a lot of fun. Some of the artworks that inspired me make cameos in the novel, as do certain historical episodes. For example, a visit in 1976 by Andy Warhol, who came to Iran in order to produce one of his famed screen prints of the Empress Farah. And lastly, I'll mention Exile, which is another prominent theme in the book. Through Hamid's family, who emigrated to the United States after the revolution, I address the sense of perpetual displacement in both time and place. Omid, Hamid's brother, a divorced poet and translator, who has had to relinquish poetry in favor of a more lucrative job as a translator of legal documents, has not managed, after decades in America, to feel established in his adoptive home. Their mother likewise fails to adapt, clinging to the past by collecting Iranian memorabilia on eBay and constantly listening to old exiled pop singers. And the father, up until his death, lives with heartache, never overcoming his grief over his absent son, his lost encyclopedia, and his forced departure from his homeland. So to finish, I'll read a short passage from a section on the father's memorial, where Hamid encounters his mother after 38 years of separation. Someone began tinkering on the piano, Mozart's A Little Night Music. When he finished, a few guests lightly applauded. "Can anyone really play?" a woman in a tobacco brown dress called out. "Hamid can play," my mother said. "He played like an angel when he was a child, but God only knows what happened since." Conversations dissolved into whispers. Everyone knew my story, or at least their own version of it. I had been laid bare as the son with a malignant past. I looked to my brother for guidance, but found none. His face, part pity, part indignation, had nothing left to offer. "Well, will you play something for us?" my mother continued, "in memory of your father, whom you loved so much." I had anticipated my mother's bitterness, but had not expected it to be so public. I kept my composure as best I could and sat down at the piano, resting my fingers on the cold and unyielding keys. Through the throat clearing in the room, I sensed the guests preparing themselves to witness a man's familial bankruptcy with both dread and glee. I shut my eyes, and what came to me was a piece I had played one winter morning when my father, just returned from Uncle Majid's funeral, had sat on the sofa and said to me, "Play something to get me through this black day." I had been sitting at the piano, practicing as I was expected to do for hours every weekend. From the kitchen came the scent of butter and eggs and chives. It was almost lunchtime and I was hungry. Not knowing what my father was asking of me, I turned the pages of my exercise book, given to me by Madame Petrosian, the Armenian lady who had fled Ottoman Anatolia and who offered me lessons every Wednesday afternoon, and I stopped at Moonlight Sonata. I played the first movement, which I had only recently learned, and which made me think of the crippled cat I had loved and lost the night I had slept under the apricot tree with my uncle. My father sat with eyes closed, and though I made many mistakes, he listened until the end. "Hamid," he said, "it's a terrible thing losing a brother." Now, sweating under my new suit, I glanced at Omid, then at my mother. I pressed one key, then another and another, until both hands were obeying my memory of the notes, and I fell into the adagio of the sonata, the melody hushed and full of things unsaid. I was overtaken by memories of bygone summers, of our old house in Tehran, of the cool scent of wet earth after a morning rain, and of the lace-cap hydrangeas, of my father and my mother and Omid. I thought too of Nushin, of how I had once loved her, and of Golnaz, my absent daughter. I did not play for myself or for them or even for grief at things lost, but for the disappointment that united us, for the constellation of our heartbreak, for the betrayal, the love, the destruction. Thank you.
Wow, Dalia, that was fantastic. I really enjoyed your presentation. I enjoyed the book when I read it, and I thought I had understood it, but you gave whole new perspective and shed light that I really enjoyed. Thank you for sharing.
Thank you so much, Mary. Thank you.
Well, we're delighted to have you with us, and I know I'm not alone in having more questions and more wonderabouts about your wonderful book. So I think with that, we will open it to some of our audience members who have questions for you.
Hi, my name is Simona Supekar. I teach English and creative writing at Pasadena City College. I wanted to also thank Pasadena Festival of Women Authors for sponsoring many of our programs, and also to express how honored I am to be here today. Dalia, I was wondering about your character, Hamid. He is a really complex character caught in doubt about his own motivations. And I was wondering if you had a particular person in mind when you crafted him.
So thank you, Simona. No, I really didn't. He's not modeled after anybody. Some of the characters in the book are, like the minister, they kind of have real life counterparts, let's say. Hamid really doesn't. he came purely from my imagination. And I think I wanted somebody who's sort of struggling with himself and somebody who is making wrong decisions, and one decision is leading to the next thing, and he's sort of getting trapped deeper and deeper into this vortex.
Hi, Dalia. I'm Sophia Aguilar. I'm actually a current undergrad at Sarah Lawrence College, and I study creative writing. So it's really great that you got your MFA there. And I'm also an alum of Write Girl. And my question is, Hamid comes from a family of privilege, and I was wondering if you saw that as a necessary element to the character development and struggles that Hamid faces.
Thank you. Not as an essential element, but I thought it adds another aspect to his character. I think it would be, there were several reasons for this. One was it would be sort of expected, to have him come from a perhaps less privileged background, so this is a little more perhaps surprising, or unexpected. The other thing is I was, just in terms of his education and so on, to be in his head, I was more comfortable being in the head of someone who had read a lot and who had sort of, certain references and so on. So for me to make him a little more believable, I chose that. But yeah, the primary reason is I didn't want him to be so predictable. So in this way, he's a little more surprising.
That's great. That's so interesting. I love that, your whole process about that. I think that's great. Thank you so much.
Hi, I'm Judy Wilson, and I'm a member of the Author Selection Committee. Hamid is at times a sympathetic character despite the cruelty that he has displayed. How were you able to find sympathy for him and convey it to the reader?
Thank you, Judy. I think for me, it was actually it ended up being the opposite problem, because if you read his childhood, you see that he starts out as a boy who's very sensitive and he loves glass, and he plays with that model train set. And so for me to justify how does a boy who starts out like that end up committing acts of brutality, that was the hard part. And I think my solution in the end was to show him as part of a larger system. So he keeps making wrong decisions, and he keeps going deeper and deeper into a situation that he can't really extract himself from, but he does question himself along the way. And I think that's what makes him compelling, because he's not just going around doing these things without thinking about it. He is somebody who's constantly interrogating himself as he's interrogating others. And I hope that's how readers end up feeling some, not necessarily empathy, but some kind of, that they can be drawn to him, that they can follow him at least through the book.
Do you think in the end he has accepted himself, or does he hate himself?
I think he has accepted who he has become. And he neither hates nor loves himself. He's just accepted that this is who he has become. And this is, as he says, my improvement, if we could call it that, was not in the betterment of my character, but in the absolute acceptance of what the world had made of me and what I had made of it. And so he's just accepted, but the step is that he has realized what he's capable of, and he doesn't want to inflict that on others anymore.
Thanks.
Hi, I'm Leslie Mason, and I'm a Write Girl alum. My question for you is, before you and your family moved to New York, you were living in a Muslim country. Can you share any particular experiences related to the cultural differences or any conflicts you had being a Jewish family in a Muslim country?
Thank you. Well, I grew up during the 70s and 80s. We left in the 80s. Prior to the revolution, Jews, at least Jews in Tehran, were quite integrated into the mainstream society. So I, at the time, didn't feel that kind of disconnect, or, we had our own traditions, we did the Jewish holidays and so on. So there was that kind of, I wouldn't call it separation, but at least distinction. But it didn't feel like, being not accepted. Now, Iranian Jews have a long history, throughout, that has changed over time. So let's just say, I won't even go very far back, but let's say in the 19th century up until the early 20th, they were still in a ghetto. And it took, a lot of different measures and efforts, one of which was the establishment of this organization from France that was called Alliance Israélite Universelle, that started all these schools throughout the Middle East to sort of raise the lot of Middle Eastern Jews. And eventually all students were accepted in these schools. But by the time I arrived, I didn't feel that divide. After the revolution, I felt it a little bit, not among close friends and so on, but in the more general discourse. However, Khomeini did make clear that Judaism was accepted as a religion. Zionism was not. So he made that distinction early on to separate the Jews from Israel. But it's been, it's been an interesting cohabitation for centuries, not just in Iran, but throughout the Middle East. And it is the opinion of many that Jews lived better in Muslim countries than they did in sort of predominantly Christian countries throughout time. And then that changed, of course, after the formation of the State of Israel and Zionism and so on. But that's a long story. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, it did. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Carolyn Siegel, and I'm on the executive committee of the Pasadena Festival of Women Authors. And thank you, Dalia, so much for joining us today. I wanted to ask you about something we heard earlier, that you love living in New York, but you still have a nostalgia for Iran. What do you miss most?
Thank you. I don't know that I would call it nostalgia, because I'm sure there is nostalgia. But I think I'm quite aware that if I were to go back, I wouldn't find it as I left it. So I'm quite clear on that. But what I miss is just a quality of belonging, which I don't necessarily feel. And I think that comes with language, that comes with references, jokes, food. It's just feeling at home where you don't have to explain yourself. And now I'm, again, also aware that if I were to go back, I wouldn't immediately feel at home. I've been gone for a long time. So I would feel estranged there too. But it's just a certain quality. It's, it's the light, the way the light is on an afternoon. It's just a way of being. And of course, I miss my past there, but I'm aware that that's gone. So, it's not an illusion.
Would you ever go back? You sort of said, if I went back, would you go back, and why or why not?
I would go back for sure if I felt like it was completely safe. It might be, and it might not be, I don't know. But because I have been writing, it's possible that it wouldn't be completely safe. So I'm waiting to see if a better time presents itself.
Thank you so much for your answers. Really appreciate your time today.
Thank you so much.
Oh my, Dalia, that was fascinating. As I said, I think I said that before, but each time I hear your answers and hear the thoughtful insights you bring, I am really impressed. Thanks so much for your presentation today and your answers to our audience questions.
And thank you so much again for having me. It was really lovely to be with you today. And also for all the people who asked questions, I thank you for listening and for your questions. And yeah, it's been an honor. Thank you.
Well, thank you. It has been an honor for us as well. And I'd also like to thank all of our guest Zoom audience. And I ask all of us to support the mission of the festival and our 2021 authors by making a donation and purchasing the authors' books by going to the PFWA website, which is listed at the end of the video presentation here. It has been a pleasure to host this conversation today, and I hope to see you all in person at the festival in 2022. Thank you.